So this is a paper about Toni Morrison's Korean War novel, and it begins with a set of claims about what the Korean War does in suturing U.S. citizens to the Cold War mentality and the national security state apparatus that turns the Cold War frame of interpretation into a necessary means of making sense of everyday events in the 1950s. Instead of inserting this frame, Holmes stages a narrative process involving Frank Money and his narrator-transcriber in an ongoing struggle over the narrator's effort to assimilate Frank Money's lived experience to pre-existing narrative tropes, much like the relationship between the fugitive slave and the narrator in a fugitive slave narrative. Holmes uses these two narrator interlocutors to tell two incompatible narratives. One narrative revolves around the intrapsychic ruminations of the Black Korean War veteran. The other transcribes the psychogeographical trajectory of this combat veteran's lived experiences. The veteran's italicized self-narration at times emerges within the free and direct discourse of the other narrator. Their novel-long dispute over the narrative's conditions of representation enables readers to recognize how a subaltern figure might participate in the production of colonial imperial regimes of knowledge, rather than, as is more frequently the case, being silently written out of them. The stakes of this contest become apparent in the novel's opening pages, when Frank Money struggles to recall the details of a childhood event that he and his younger sister, Isidra C., witnessed on a stud farm not far from their home in Lotus, Georgia. Frank took C there to enjoy the mating rituals of a herd of beautiful bay horses that, in quotes, stood like men. They bit each other like dogs, but when they stood, reared up on their hind legs, their forelegs around the withers of the other, we held our breath in wonder. On their way home, the sojourners became helpless onlookers to a lurid spectacle of violence. The figures in this scene, an African-American father and his son, compelled to fight each other to the death with knives, in quotes, the game was set up so that only the one left alive could leave. So one of them had to kill the other. White spectators who coerced the dying black man buried alive with, in quotes, 1 foot stuck up over the edge of a shallow grave, participate in an act of anti-black violence that is a world-constituting ritual. Although Frank Money will require the remainder of the narrative to recall the details of this primal scene of anti-black violence, it nevertheless preconditions his lived experience of everyday colonial violence in the 1950s U.S. culture. In the remarks that follow, I intend to elaborate on the significance of Frank Money's effort to remember this scene from the 1950s culture of the Korean War era without the aide-de-memoire of hegemonic Cold War master narrative. This effort will oblige me to engage a question that is central to this inquiry. Since the Cold War's bipolar frame customarily regulates the what, when, where, why, and how of Korean War memoirs, what anamnestic procedure has Morrison invented to replace this master narrative? The Korean War Frank Money experiences in Home complicates the distinction between the biological racism of colonial imperialism and the Cold War's putative totalitarian surrogate by turning the former, the biological racism of colonial imperialism, into the precondition for the representation of the latter. After the Second World War, the United States imperial state incorporated South Korea and other decolonizing countries across the global South as peripheries within a world system governed by the logic of capital accumulation. The imagined geopolitical line delineating the countries enclosed within these peripheries reinscribed Du Bois' color line as a dogma line. Insofar as the coloniality of power continues to determine what Du Bois dubbed the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa in America and the islands of the sea, the problem of the color line has extended its reach into the 21st century. In other words, the Cold War was supposed to have displaced the color line with a dogma line that replaced biological racism with interiorized ideologies that generated what theorists call a totalitarian race. The Korean War reintroduced biological racism and the color line. When Frank Money returns home to a 1950s US culture that has come unstitched from the Cold War bipolar frame, he cannot discern the salient differences between the colonial settler violence he encounters across US Southern culture and the colonial imperial violence he practiced in Korea. The North Global South geohistorical color line constitutes the interpretive frame through which the narrator of Home makes sense of Frank Money's lived experience within the periphery. The place of the Global South is not wholly tethered to Frank's Korean past, in which he did not fully experience it, nor in the present, in which he does not clearly understand its significance. Yet the North Global South geohistoric color line constitutes the interpretive frame through which the narrator makes sense of Frank Money's experience. The reader's first encounter with the Global South does not take place in Korea, but in the Pacific Northwest of Seattle, where Frank reads the sign that bears the injunction, "No part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by any Hebrew or by any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or Asiatic race, excepting only employees in domestic service." In the United States, as this sign makes clear, Jim Crow inscribed the spatial disjunction and temporal non-synchronicity that the Global South perpetuates within this series of racialized categorizations. It is this sign, moreover, that brings home to Frank Money the dual recognition that the coloniality of power cannot be restricted to events in the Korean War, and that Choiseul, Korea, and Lotus, Georgia, are comparable sites of colonial violence. If the Korean War instituted the Cold War that reorganized the geographies of the decolonizing world, then Korea's condition of perpetual war, this is why this most recent signing of the pact is going to change the entire East Asian configuration of power, which is the rationale. The Korea's condition of perpetual war also names the geo-ontopolitical condition of this third world, whose countries have not yet undergone actual decolonization. Toni Morrison's Home in part bears witness to the refugees from the unending colonial wars occulted by Cold War ideology. When the narrator removes the bipolar Cold War narrative frame from the narration of Home, the reader encounters profound similarities between Korean War refugees and the Black Korean War veteran Frank Money, who, like his Korean War counterparts, finds himself embroiled in an unending cycle of colonial imperial violence. The Korean War is not a historically completed state of affairs, or at least not yet, but a constantly restructuring field of symbolic and actual violence. The Korean War names the obscene colonial race war supplement to Cold War ideology as a permanent war that resists the Cold War's triumphalist periodization. The Korean War reveals the colonial imperial violence this Cold War state perforce disavows, which is why it calls it a Cold War. The underpinning of the Cold War is the generalized, permanent, and violent war that still continues across the so-called Global South. Rather than acceding to such a disavowal, Toni Morrison's 2012 novel, Home, introduces a topography interconnecting catastrophized landscapes that bear traces of colonial imperial violence in the United States to geographies of violence in Korea. Whereas the generalized forgetting of that violence was the psychosocial precondition for the formation of the national security state, Toni Morrison creates a narrative apparatus that compels the Black Korean War veteran Frank Money, the novel's protagonist, to remember what the Cold War state wanted forgotten. The Korean War was the first U.S. war fought under military desegregation, and the reason military desegregation happened in a colonial space was so that the state could simultaneously regulate it, treat it as if it were simply going to take place in a state of colonial warfare, and so that the state could also manage, regulate, and understand the experiment of color blindness that was first trafficked in Executive Order 9981, partly under pressure from the Committee Against Jim Crow in Military Service and Training, formed by A. Philip Randolph and Grant Reynolds. Black enlistment rose to the point where, by the end of 1953, 90% of African Americans were serving in integrated units, and the armed forces were now overall more mixed than any civil institution, not counting prisons. President Truman made desegregation part of his Korean War strategy to render African Americans dependent on the military in distant places, where they were expected to take part in battles against racially marked persons constructed as inhuman and unassimilable to the domestic society. The desegregated military itself thereby became a zone of colonial imperial violence. As the sequestered colonial space for the limited application of the policy of equal opportunity, Korea became the unacknowledged signifier for the colonial geography in which desegregated blacks would be assembled. Under his return home, Frank Money rendered both of these zones of colonial imperial violence, Korea, zones of militarized desegregation, hyper-visible within the domestic sphere. Underpinned by the matrix of anti-black violence that Frank and C witnessed 15 years earlier on that stud farm, the desegregation of the military neither suspended nor deactivated the state's racism. When the state recruited Frank to engage in men treated like dogs battles to the death within a racially marked colonial space in Korea, it did not promise to integrate him as a citizen at the war's conclusion. If, as NSC 68 proposed, Korea should be understood to be, in quotes, an experimental war, one being fought back and forth for the purpose of testing men, weapons, materials, and methods on a continuing basis, these same men and methods were often being tested on black bodies within the domestic United States as well. The state regarded Frank and his sister C as supernumerary, extraneous bodies that could be repurposed as specimens for either scientific experimentation or incarceration. Korean War veterans Robert F. Williams, Bobby Seale, James Foreman, and Amira Baraka credited the similarity they perceived between the zones of colonial imperial violence in Korea and the network of disciplinary, punitive, and militaristic institutions awaiting them on their return to the United States as catalysts for their transformative social commitments to the civil rights and black power movements. Here is how an Associated Negro Press wire service distilled the composite of their insights. America is the last bulwark of the colonial powers. In Korea, in Indochina, in Tunisia, in South Africa, in India, the West Indies, South America, and the United States, the magic that made chattel slaves of some, peons of many, and sharecroppers of others is furiously losing its charm. In a 2013 conversation recorded in Interview magazine, Toni Morrison said she decided to write about the 50s because she regards it as a decade in which somebody was hiding something. And by somebody, I mean the narrative of the country, which was so aggressively happy. And I kept thinking, that kind of insistence, there's something fake about it. So I began to think about what it was like for me, my perception at that time. Then I thought about what was really going on. What was really going on was the Korean War. It was called a police action then, never a war, even though 53,000 soldiers died. And the other thing going on in the 1950s was Joseph McCarthy. And they were killing black people right and left. In 1955, Emmett Till was killed, and later there was also a lot coming to the surface about medical experimentation. Now we know about the LSD experiments on soldiers, but there was experimentation with syphilis that was going on with black men at Tuskegee who thought they were receiving health care. The Cold War produced a generalized substitution of symbolic ideological violence for real colonial violence. Home disrupts and detotalizes the hegemonic Cold War narrative that had monopolized understanding of the 50s at home and abroad. Events and reference, like the Morrison case, it's a famous case about a play by Alfred Maltz, who was imprisoned and blacklisted because he refused to testify before McCarthy's House of Un-American Activities Committee, comes untethered. All of these events and reference come untethered from the narrative that had formerly endowed them with ideological significance and historical intelligibility. In seeing the 50s through the eyes of a black veteran of the Korean War who had not internalized Cold War ideology and was not interpolated to the national security state, Morrison removes the scab to expose the congeries of racist logics the Cold War claimed to have superseded. Home returns us to a 50s past that was not yet saturated in the Cold War script that cast it as the greatest decade. She thereby remembers much of what the narrative of the greatest generation consigns to forgetfulness. Morrison uses a series of specters, and by the way, when Frank Money is not interpolated as a subject citizen, he's interpolated as what is other than a subject, and he does not venture to become assimilated as a subject. He becomes a condition of ongoing fugitivity that's comparable to the notion of existential restlessness and transitionality that Ronald spoke about earlier. Morrison uses a series of specters emanating from the afterlife of racial slavery: the ghost in the zoot suit, an image of a boy pushing his own entrails back inside his torn body, the African-American migrant worker killed in a men treated like a dogfight and buried in a shallow grave, as figures through whom Frank Money can encounter the real psychic violence of state racism. Frank Money belongs within the terrain of an ongoing colonial imperialist formation in which the figure of the fugitive slave serves as the quite literally vanishing mediator, interconnecting the Black Korean War veteran, Korean refugees, and participants in the African, Asian, and Middle Eastern diasporas. As Frank travels along a 20th century version of the Underground Railroad with the Green Book in hand, we bear witness to a series of scenes of anti-black violence: the exodus of a black community under threat of attack by the Ku Klux Klan in Bandera County, Texas, the stoning of a black couple for daring to order coffee at a roadside diner, Frank's arbitrarily being stopped and frisked, and the prevailing anxiety among black Americans that being outside isn't necessary for legal or illegal disruption, that men with or without badges, but always with guns, could force you to move. Frank Money's return home as a refugee from the Korean War triggers spontaneous, involuntary memories of the fugitive slave past that become cotemporal allies of colonial settler violence, which constitutes the terrain for both forms of fugitivity. Frank Money does not exactly return home with, he returns home as the embodied memory of the impossible object cause, the racialized violence of colonial imperial war, of 1950s US Cold War culture. The narrator's representations of Frank's battlefield encounters in Korea assume the form of involuntary flashbacks to scenes of colonial racial violence. The aforementioned ritual slaughter of an African-American man by townspeople in Lotus, Georgia, Frank's killing of a young girl while serving as a guard in Korea that had taken place years earlier. Kathy Carruth has described a flashback, what Morrison elsewhere refers to as rememories, as the sudden and unexpected recurrence of a traumatic event, as an involuntary occurrence of an unrecoverable memory. A flashback paradoxically intertwines two incompatible elements: the repetition of the scene of a trauma, along with the inability to have conscious access to its contents. as the spontaneous repetition of what returns. A flashback is not simply an overwhelming experience that has been obstructed by a later repression or amnesia. It is more importantly an event that is itself constituted in part out of its lack of integration in consciousness. It is the fact that the costs of recollecting such traumatic memories are catastrophic, which requires their segregation within the chronotopical phenomena called flashbacks. The history that a flashback tells is therefore a history that literally has no place, either in the past, in which it was not fully experienced, or in the present, in which its precise images and enactments are not fully understood. Frank Money's flashbacks reveal his awareness of the transcontinental reach of the colonial imperial apparatus that is capable of re-territorializing Lotus, Georgia, within the terrain of Choisin, Korea, and of treating them both as more or less interchangeable locales in Hinat Kwan's other Cold War. He's a Korean anthropologist. The difference between these sites, as Frank explains, is that at least on the battlefield there is some chance of winning, along with many chances of losing. Death is a sure thing, but life is just as certain. Problem is, you can't know in advance. But life is just, whereas in Lotus, you did know in advance, since there was no future, just long stretches of killing time. There was no goal other than breathing, nothing to win and save for somebody else's quiet death, nothing to survive or worth surviving for. In a variation of call and response, the narrator intersperses italicized pages in which Frank Money interrupts the narrative to correct the narrator's version of events or to question the narrator's qualification to tell his story. The social contradictions and the cultural differences between the First World and the Global South animate the disjunctive spatial and temporal interactions between the narrator and the narratee, Frank Money. The narrator's third-person account of Frank Money's narrative supplies the basis for reclaiming the regulative political concepts of the supposedly authoritative First World narrative, whose rules of reproduction were prescribed in Cold War ideology. In other words, free and direct discourse is what communicates the entire normative ideological system. Frank's contestation with the narrator over the conditions of his representation alienates him from the narrated simulacrum the narrator has imagined, and enables him to change the subject position from which and about which he speaks. Frank's interruptions of the narrator's discourse also permit him to negotiate the conditions of his narrative within an enunciative present of the narrator's discourse, so as to revise the version of past to which that narrative has recalled him, and thereby to recount new histories, and from them, new presents and new futures. The ongoing dialogue between Frank Money and his narrator specifically disrupts the narrator's efforts to conscript Frank to a political and ontological continuation of the order of colonial settler violence that has rendered Frank Money a refugee. He does not want to change from the condition of permanent refugee. He does not want to become assimilated. That is not the teleology of this narrative. In reference to Korea, Frank warns, you can't imagine it because you weren't there. You can't describe the bleak landscape because you never saw it. The narrator of Home occasionally uses free and direct discourse to bear secondary witness to the traumatic events that Frank cannot or will not recall. Unlike direct discourse, which reports speech as the unmediated expression of a speaker's own thoughts, and unlike the indirect discourse that entails a second person in the citation of the speech of a first person to a third person, free and direct discourse restages a first person speech and thought as a third person narration. According to Martin J., free and direct discourse accords the narrator an impersonal power, a subject without a subjectivity that is authorized to penetrate the psychobiological processes of the characters under its provenance. At moments when Frank Money construes the narrator's free and direct discourse as a biopolitical apparatus that would regulate his psychosocial behavior, he understandably berates the narrator for this intrusion. there's something going on here that I am unaware of. How do I handle? Earlier you wrote about how sure I was that that beat-up man on the train to Chicago would turn around when they got home and whip the wife who tried to help him. Not true. I didn't think any such thing. What I thought was that he was proud of her, but didn't want to show how proud he was to the other men on the train. I don't think you know much about love, or me. Mary Duziak views Frank's hostile questioning of the narrator's presumption of the ability to know how Frank thinks and feels as Morrison's exploration of the limits of fictional empathy. Frank Money also criticizes the narrator's imaginative rendering of his traumatic experiences. Frank Money's recollections of the Korean War instigate what Shoshana Feldman and Dory Loud have referred to as crises of witnessing, activated within events that cannot be assimilated by a subject whose identity is predicated on its continuity throughout disparate experiences. Such crises occur when an experience is undergone whose radical alterity poses an insuperable challenge to the limits of human comprehension. Restoration of a traumatic event that cannot be articulated to the socio-symbolic order requires a retroactive encounter between the survivor, the primary witness to the experience, and a belated listener whose bearing secondary witness keeps record of the survivor's testimony. As substitute for the absent historical witness, the narrator, as secondary witness, must become the bearer of responsibility for an event. Like the primal scene of anti-black violence at the beginning of Frank Money's narrative, that can be assimilated neither to the socio-symbolic order nor to the subjectivities that order legitimates. Last page. In a sense, Frank Money's narrative in its entirety can be understood as his effort to return home safely with his sister C from that primal scene of anti-black violence. Were there a place called home to which they could return? Since, as Frank and the reader discover, anti-black violence saturates the socio-symbolic order of 50s America, however, Frank cannot remember that primal scene within the order that it founds. But he does not experience the need to find an alternative to that order until he realizes that he has reperformed the act of racist violence that he witnessed with C as a 5-year-old boy when he murders a young girl in Korea. That memory is so difficult to acknowledge as his recollection that he recalls it twice. In the first reminiscence, he tells the narrator that his relief guard in the police action performed it. My relief guard comes over, sees her hand, and shakes his head, smiling. As he approaches her, she raises up, and in what looks like a hurried, even automatic gesture, she says something in Korean, sounds like yum yum. She smiles, reaches for the soldier's crotch, touches it. It surprises him, yum yum. As soon as I look away from her hand to her face, see the 2 missing teeth, the fall of black hair above eager eyes, he blows her away. Only the hand remains in the trash, clutching its treasure, a spotted, rotting orange. Following his confession that it was he and not the relief guard who shot this girl, he's doubling as the figure he has been conscripted to embody in the police action. That is, of the militarized police guard who performs the action. And the only way he can dissociate from that figure is by bearing witness to exactly what happened, as if he's simultaneously the primary agent and the secondary addressee. Following his confession that it was he and not the relief guard who shot this girl, Frank admits his responsibility for a repertoire of scenes of racialized colonial violence. He realizes his entire military service in the Korean War had turned him into a willing participant in the acts of colonial settler violence that forced him to flee from his home in Bandera, Texas, rendered him a perpetrator of race murder comparable to the one he and C witnessed on the stud farm, and made him a party in men treated like dogfights he would later find abhorrent. These scenes recover the disavowed history of racialized colonial violence, previously disallowed representation within the archive of Korean War literature. Frank Money knows that the recovery of the truth of such story materializes the only pathway that will enable him to return without getting buried alive within a social order that is founded upon the continuation of the Korean War's regime of racial colonial violence. in providing this alternative narrative of the Korean War, comprised of the restoration of scenes, actions, persons, and events omitted forcibly from the archive of Korean War literature, Frank Money has opened up a space that, insofar as it cannot be included within the social order founded upon the primal scene of anti-black violence, takes the place of home as a condition of permanent restlessness. That's it. Questions?
Thank you very much. I offer something that may be useful. It's certainly, I think, an interesting anecdotal paratext. I met Toni Morrison's slightly younger contemporary, the once well-known novelist John Updike, once in my life, in like 1990 or 91. That is to say, just after what counted as the end of the Cold War in the qualified sense that you've represented it. And he said of how much less interesting he found life now that the Cold War was over. And I said, tell me more about that. I said, I remember in college, listening to the radio to hear news of the Korean War.
Yeah, I think that Updike's existential, theological engagements are of a piece with the moral abyss structuring Cold War ideology. And I also think it's a tacit reason for Joseph Frank becoming a Slavicist in the 50s. And I think that it's one of the ways in which Joseph Frank could feel as if he was a double agent. To return it to your wonderful paper. Yes, Ronald.
Thank you. This is a novel I know, but you've given me an additional insight to it. A couple of remarks and perhaps even a gift. Of course, I like the way in which you've done really three things. Two explicitly in the performance. And those two have to do with connecting the question of domestic violence with international violence, and that it's a continuum. And also the way that Frank's scene of murder always bothered me, but you've shown nicely and very, very subtly and generously the mechanism by which the disenfranchised who are subject to the domestic violence become interpolated as agents of that same violence elsewhere.
And made to re-perform.
Two uncles. One of my uncles was with the First Fleet that got surrounded by the Red Guard. And it was in Korea, as a black man, that he acquired a certain political consciousness when it was pointed out to him by one of the Korean suffragists, he was a Marine, that precisely what you're talking about, which is, of course, what comes back with a lot of the troops, and then another who fought on Pork Chop Hill. And so you show the way in which that comes into and informs the civil rights discourse and the radical discourse. And those three things are beautiful, as well as the fact that the way you tell the story shows us that we forget that war is not over, and that indeed is the paradigm of the permanent defense state. And then the gift. Do you know Manuel Zapata Oliveira?
No, I don't.
He's one of the preeminent Afro-descendiente Colombian writers, and many consider him to be part of the realismo mavioso, magical realism. 1967, he has a novel that I think you might find interesting as a comparison to what you're doing with Morrison. And it's called Chambacu, Coral de Negros. It's been translated, Chambacu, which is about how the Colombians as a nation were compelled by the United States to send troops to Korea and then how the Colombians, in response to that demand from the Cold War United States, sent the black troops to Korea. And so it echoes, and the whole conceit is about a communist who comes back.
Look at this.
Yeah.
Hinojosa writes in the United States a series of novels about his understanding of the ways in which Chicanos were conscripted as what made him aware of the global South within the territory of the United States. There's a logic to this that is kind of demonic. All of the opposition to the Vietnam War is actually structured on the foreclosure of the acknowledgement of the violence of the Korean War and kept it. That is, even when MASH, which appears as a hyper-popular television series, is constantly re-aired, it's interpreted as an anti-Vietnam, even though it's set in the Korean War, it's interpreted as an anti-Vietnam War television series. And it's so interpreted because there is a primordial foreclosure of recognition. That is, if you're trying to figure out how to put together a psychosocial mentality or disposition that will have fail-safe mechanisms, get a primal forgetting as the ground. That which you need to forget in order to allow representative figurations to emerge. The ground of the Cold War mentality is the foreclosed acknowledgement of the ongoing hot war throughout the global South, for which Korea is the primary nexus. And I believe that when the North and the South arrive at a diplomatic truce, that the whole configuration of power in East Asia and the empire of bases that the United States has throughout East Asia will be in a position to get dismantled. And I think that that is the long-term strategy of North and South. They're acknowledging that it is that the United States had replaced Japan as the figure who brought the endless colonial imperial violence to the Korean Peninsula. And now, and if you looked at the way in which that ceremony of rapprochement was staged, it's all Korean folk songs and ceremonies that emerged with real force during the forms of resistance, the periods of resistance to colonial imperial warfare. And I think that North and South leaders have figured out how to get the militarized zone out of Korea altogether, and that is a very important move. And Toni Morrison writes this in 2012 when Operation Homecoming is getting all these NEA backing because it was designed to, Petraeus came up with the idea. So we'll get the veterans who are managing populations in Afghanistan and Iraq to come home with the stories, of how they managed these colonial populations. And it's also the moment in which you're getting the excess celebration of the 50s as the greatest generation. And so she's putting right into the core of that overdetermined site a very brilliant reconfiguration.
If I may, it's also the moment when the SPLC begins to note the extent to which those veterans coming back
Excellent.
are coming back with white supremacist notions and are infiltrating and militarizing the police.
Wonderful.
Which makes your point. There's this.
Yes. If you see that the police, it maintains the mentality of a colonial imperial cyber violence. It's the militarized mentality of that. That's what she's uncovering with real brilliance. Yes, Lindsay.
I think it's just I really like this. I think the Americans, including myself, are going to be really shocked when they discover how angry the people in Asia might become. Because World War II, we treat like it was such a heroic. It was another fight of Americans against Asians. They just again and again. I'm just speaking in very imprecise terms, but just again and again, the Americans have fought and killed Asians.
Ina Kwan has this wonderful book called The Other Cold War.
The
other Cold War.
Did you cite it?
Yeah, and it goes into precisely the detail. This also has wax autobiographical. When I was very little, my father was a veteran of the Second World War, and he was a tough bird. He had some
your
really,
father might be.
He had a lot of tough lawyers as his cronies, and I never saw fear on his face, ever, until he watched Truman come forward with the declaration about the war and then the peace, because he says this is going to make it endless. And he saw that. He saw that when it came, and it sticks with you. You figure there's something there that needs to be figured out. And
Just like the quote
Korean
from
War
Home.
veterans who came home were the basis for noir films that were, Korean War vet is the core protagonist. If you want to get a great noir, get a Korean War vet. And those Korean War vet noir movies were filmed at the same time as you had a whole a surplus of dumping onto of movies that returned to the victory culture.
And novels too.
And novels from here to
Like
eternity.
the novels,
All the Korean War called for, allowed as the cover story, the victory narratives of World War II novelists. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the question of complicity and racism, because this Korean War forced the black army people to be complicit in this kind of racism. And it reminded me of the essay by Primo Levi, The Gray Zone, where he talks about the camp and the hierarchy of the camp, and how the Nazis used the whole system to enlist the victims to become part of the racism.
The trusted guards.
Yes.
The survivors.
The couples and
it was part of that, but it even had a more twisted rationale. They knew, that is when I say they, the policymakers and the strategists who came up with the post-war settlement, they knew they had to get a global mentality that could be readily sutured to the U.S. citizens' pre-existing dispositions. And they knew that when they sent back to the United States black soldiers who had been in a desegregated military, who were then constructed as militarized advocates, weaponized advocates of desegregation, that there would be this huge, this intense reaction formation. And that's what Toni Morrison is recording when she has. The Green Book was this book that came out in the where you explained safe places to go. In the World War, it was actually, I think it started in 1935. Wasn't the Green Book initially published in 35? And it shows safe places to go throughout the territory of the United States. That's what Frank Money is given by a minister after he escapes from a psychiatric ward, who says the only way you're going to keep yourself out of captivity by the U.S. military is if you take this Green Book and follow this line. And so Frank Money takes off his dog tags so that he becomes completely unstitched, untethered from the entire apparatus. And when he does that, he becomes indistinguishable from the figures who appear to him as ghosts in the narrative. The most remarkable of these figures is a man in a zoot suit, who on a certain level is a version of Malcolm X, who wore a blue zoot suit when he was Malcolm X, and who is in Morrison's construction of this, the zoot suit is aligning the reaction with Black Power resistance, and that is brought into tension with aligning the reaction to the rescue of C. And once he rescues his sister, she's in an experiment in eugenics that's controlled by a Southern eugenicist whose name is Dr. Beauregard Lee. And he is the only explicit anti-communist figure in the narrative. And when he rescues C, they have this uncanny relation to the figures who appear at each other's hallucinations. She sees the figure of the young Korean girl after she discovers that she can't have a baby. And she says to Frank, that child who's unborn, that dead child who's unborn is ours. And then he realizes that the child who died, by dying becomes simultaneously pre-birth and afterlife, is the figure who shares their condition of relationality. It's an amazing narrative, and I love it.
I'm sorry, there's so much you've given there.
Yeah.
When you say that they knew, right? I want you to say a bit more, because at the same time that the war is winding down, under the Eisenhower administration, we have the King Alfred plan, which you may know about, where it becomes a model of policing, where you set a whole series of police precincts around black communities in containment. Is that a sign that they knew? Right? And also, only Morrison can write a book like this. As you're talking, I'm saying, there's a relationship between home and a mercy.
Yes, there is.
And telling a story.
Deep relation.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's really good. Okay, you've heard enough.